Worlds Collide Part 1. Chapter 1. Routine. The day began like any other. Raisin bran for breakfast, everyday fatigues, and the 15-minute drive to the base. Nothing seemed off as I entered the building through the security hall. As was routine for the research facility, I emptied my pockets, slipped off my belt and boots, and stepped through the scanner. I'd been scanned so many times coming and going, I swore I'd end up with some form of cancer. "Shit, I'm sorry, I forgot my glasses," I mumbled. The armed security officer shot me an annoyed look as I stepped back, dropping my glasses into the plastic bin for him to send through the smaller scanner. "Here you go, Sergeant," the second security officer announced, handing me back my belongings. "Thank you," I replied with a forced smile. I didn't feel happy, but the frustration of going to work wasn't their fault. They probably dealt with hundreds of irritable people every day. They were merely doing their job. "How's your morning?" I inquired, though I didn't truly care. I just hoped the sentiment was appreciated. "Another day in paradise," he responded absently. It was obvious he wasn't up for casual conversation either. I gathered my belongings and settled into the hard black chair against the far wall to don my boots, then my belt. I scooped up my wallet, ID, change, and keys, tossed the bin onto a pile with several others, and headed outside across the compound toward my building. I passed several soldiers, acknowledging each as was customary. I knew many by face and a few by name, though I didn't pause to converse. I really wanted to reach my office and avoid morning formation. I saw my platoon milling around outside the front door as I slipped by, yelled at my supervisor to gain his attention, waved, and ducked inside. The building smelled of fresh wax, and the tiled floors mirrored the LED lighting. They wouldn't retain that pristine state for long once 100 or so soldiers barged through on their way to their stations. My office wasn't far, just a couple of turns down 2 hallways. It even boasted a window overlooking the front lawn, where soldiers would soon conduct police call to gather errant pieces of paper or cigarette butts. The tile floor gave way to carpet in the waiting room just outside my office. I was almost home free. "Sergeant Mitchel," intoned my captain's voice. I turned with a practiced smile. "Good morning, ma'am. What you need?" Captain Mercer stood tall for a woman, slender, easygoing, and, to be honest, easy on the eyes. Her long red hair was braided and spun into a bun, as military policy dictated. Freckles adorned her fair cheeks, and her smile was infectious. "There will be civilian and military officials moving around the building today. I wanted to remind you to be on your best behavior." "But of course, ma'am," I said, coming to attention and snapping a genuine salute. "I am always the model of best behavior." "That's what I'm talking about, Mitchell," she responded with mock exasperation. "Do you have your dress blues?" "Always." I disliked wearing them for long periods. They seemed to attract every particle of contrasting objects. The last time I wore them, I'd scuffed my shoe on an IV pole, leaving a permanent mark that required replacing them. I could probably get away with not having my dress uniform in my office, but I had to set an example. All 4 of my soldiers were expected to have theirs in their offices for such an occasion. "Change into them," she instructed before ducking back into her office and closing the door. I assumed she was about to do the same. I sighed as I punched in my cipher pin on the heavy wooden door to my office. I had just tucked in my light blue button-down shirt when a knock sounded at the door. "Just a second," I called out. I barely managed to get my second shoe on before another knock. I let out an irritated sigh as I opened the door to find one of my most irritating soldiers waiting. "Change," I snapped. Newly promoted Sergeant Reed was my subordinate counterpart. Ever since I helped her get promoted, she'd been doing everything she could to take my job. I stepped around her before she could utter anything to set me off. Another, more competent soldier lurked in the office on the other side of the waiting room. Specialist Moore was our new biologics control officer. He had replaced me 2 months prior when Sergeant Reed filed a complaint about my handling of the position. I was relieved of my position while an investigation was performed. I was ultimately found not at fault, but the damage was already done. "Hey, Moore," I barked as I stuck my head in his office. "Yes, Sergeant?" "Did you hear about the big wigs who'll be milling about?" I asked. Moore nodded. "Want to escape playing dress-up?" "Yeah," he responded excitedly. "Cool. Grab your Arctic gear. Today seems like a good day to inventory and inspect the cryogenics. Moore jumped up, grabbed his Arctic jacket and gloves, and followed me out of the section. The cryogenic units resided at the other end of the facility in their own secure location. Only a handful of people possessed access. Moore and I were two. While Reed had tried to take my job, she failed to realize she didn't have the clearance, and most importantly, nobody liked her. My next stop was my supervisor's office. His door stood open as I approached. I knocked respectfully. "Hey, boss. Specialist Moore and I are heading to biologics to conduct inventory. Unless you need me here, we don't have any vaccines today." Sergeant First Class Davis glanced up and waved me away. "Sounds good." We passed through several quarantine areas on our way. We didn't really need to take our current route. We could have avoided all the secure areas if we'd opted for the main halls. I honestly enjoyed cutting through the research sections. I knew who was researching what, and I found it interesting to observe them in their blue pressure suits, ballooned out from the positive pressure created by coiled air hoses, tethering them to the ceiling. I'd actually gotten to try out a training suit. It was challenging to assemble a Lincoln log house while wearing it, but fun to try. Everything appeared routine for the most part, except something caught my eye when we passed one of the Level 5 biosafety labs. I almost missed it had it not been for one of the lab techs stepping away to a stainless steel table, revealing a somewhat humanoid feline. I say she was feline because I had no other explanation for what I was looking at. I didn't get a chance to investigate, since the doctor moved back into my field of view, obscuring any other details. I caught up with Moore just as he stepped through the secure double door into another restricted hall filled with people in suits, both civilian and military, with multiple stars on their shoulders, blocking our path. I nearly collided with Moore as he made an abrupt stop and stepped back. "Oh shit, sorry, Sarge." "Hey, who's there?" boomed a deep, commanding voice. I stepped around Moore to intercept whoever had noticed us. "I'm sorry, sir," I said to the general who stepped in front of me. "We did not realize there was anything scheduled in this area." The general's uniform bore enough medals to be the envy of every private. "Who are you, Sergeant, and why are you here?" His voice was deep and gravelly. He wasn't very tall, yet he loomed before me. "Sergeant Mitchel," I stated, coming to attention. "I am the biologics use officer. We are heading to cryogenics for weekly inventory, sir." "Is this the usual path to reach your destination, Sergeant?" he probed suspiciously. "It is the most direct route, sir," I responded matter-of-factly. "Sergeant Major Sykes," he called over his shoulder. "Sir?" The sergeant major was a muscular black man who towered over me by about half a foot. He wore the usual practiced, "don't walk on my grass" face common to every sergeant major I had ever met. "Ensure these two soldiers find another way to the cryogenic storage," growled the general as he turned away. "Yes, sir," responded Sergeant Major Sykes. To us, he ordered, "Follow me." He led us down the hall in the opposite direction and out of the biosafety area. I was about to walk off to my final destination when the sergeant major gripped my shoulder. "You saw nothing," he admonished warningly and released me. "Roger," I responded and continued on without looking back. Neither of us spoke until we arrived in the cryogenic warehouse. "What was that about, Mitchell?" inquired Specialist Moore as he slipped on his Sub-Zero jacket. "Your guess is as good as mine," I responded. I thought it best not to mention what I had seen to him, just in case there was any follow-up from our encounter. I pulled out my access card, slipped it into the scanner on the walk-in cryo, and punched in my code. The lock cycled on the door. "Remember, you have 15 minutes before you have to come out," I said, pulling the door open. It emitted a hiss as the vacuum seal broke, and cold steam billowed out in response to the much warmer air. Moore stepped inside and I closed the door behind him, sealing it. "I heard something that sounded like an explosion. We need to check it out," I said urgently before Moore had even began his count. We had just entered the biosafety area when alarms began sounding. "Containment breach. All personnel are to shelter in place." It repeated before the alarm sounded again, and the same speech continued. I didn't know what had happened, but I was sure it involved the felinoid creature. We rounded a corner to find people sprawled over the floor, some moving, others not. Lights flickered as sparks illuminated the dim hall. Moore and I both froze at the end of the hall. It was only a brief pause, but it felt like an eternity. "Go get help," I ordered, backhanding Moore in the chest. The moment Moore sprinted away, I rushed in and grabbed the first semi-conscious person I came to, dragging him away through the small fires and flying sparks. Had I not panicked, I would have grabbed one of the biosafety suits first, or possibly a fire extinguisher. "Stay awake, sir," I shouted to the Army officer as I dragged him through one of the security doors, outside what I thought was the danger zone. Red lights blinked throughout the halls. Closer to the ruptured Biosafety 5 lab, it illuminated the smoke-filled hall like a rave party. I checked the pulse of a civilian and moved on to the next when I couldn't feel a heartbeat. There was no point in wasting time on him at this point. My medic training emphasized triage and not getting caught up in CPR while others might be saved. The entire situation was a matter of triage. Help who had the best chance and move on from those who did not. Triage to me meant grabbing anyone breathing and getting them out. I coughed as smoke filled my lungs, but I pushed on. I found the general from earlier. A piece of glass protruded from his face. He was still breathing, but unconscious. He was the fourth person I dragged from the area. There were still about another dozen or so to retrieve. I reached the door of the lab and found the felinoid woman crouched in the corner. I don't know what possessed me to grab a biosuit and thrust it at her, but here I was, telling her to put it on and grab the doctor whom I pointed to. I gave her a moment, then grabbed an unconscious lab tech and began dragging him away. The thickening smoke forced me to bend lower. My back screamed from the effort. It would have been easier if I could have lifted them to carry, but that was impossible. I didn't know if he or the doctor was even alive, but if I was going to help the strange woman escape, I needed her to pretend to be someone helping save others. I didn't know if she understood what I was saying. She hesitated a moment, but did as I instructed, following my example. We dragged the doctor and tech down a different hall than I had taken the others. Once we were through the door, I grabbed the doctor's ID and handed it to her. She stared at me suspiciously but took it. I pointed down another hall to a door I knew exited outside. I didn't wait to see if she understood. I had others to attend to. By the time I returned, others were joining in the triage process. Unlike myself, they were dressed in full containment systems. One person grabbed the collar of my shirt and dragged me away. "You can't be here, Sergeant." I didn't recognize the female voice but complied hesitantly. I'm not sure I could have really resisted since my head was beginning to swim. I allowed myself to be escorted outside to an awaiting medic wearing a mask, gloves, and wielding an oxygen mask. "Remain here," she instructed and departed. The medic assisted me to the ground and handed me the oxygen mask. "Are you okay, Mitchell? Are you injured anywhere?" The voice was familiar. Staff Sergeant Connors patted my torso and back, searching for blood. "You look okay. What were you thinking? You know better than to approach that area without a suit," he scolded. I coughed hard. My lungs were on fire, and my eyes burned like I had just gone through a CS chamber. "I think I'm okay." "Do you know what was in that room?" I gasped between coughing fits. "They said it was nothing fatal, but that's all." Staff Sergeant Connors glanced around. "Hold tight. I have others to tend to." And just like that, I was alone. Well, sort of. I remained in a triage area for what might be considered walking wounded. There were others either lying on the ground or sitting up, appearing about how I felt. I began searching the immediate area for the strange woman but saw no evidence of her presence. I hoped I had made the right decision helping her. I couldn't really see much. Everything more than a few feet away blurred as I tried to peer through tear-soaked eyes. I didn't have to sit around long before another medic came and escorted me to an awaiting ambulance. "We're taking you to Bethesda, Sergeant." I only nodded and allowed myself to be ushered along like an unruly toddler. I must have dozed off during the ride. When I opened my eyes, I was in an emergency room with someone shining a bright light in my eye. "What the hell?" I snapped as I tried to swat away the offending object. "Calm down, Sergeant Mitchell. You are in the emergency department at Bethesda Medical Center," explained the young-looking doctor. "My name is Dr. Zahir. Can you tell me how you feel?" "My head aches, and my body feels like someone took a bat to me," I answered in irritation. "How is your vision? How many fingers am I holding up?" "1, 2, I said, counting them. What day is it? Monday. Do you know where you are? Continued the doctor. Bethesda, I responded. Good. We are going to get an EKG, labs, and an X-ray before we get you admitted, he said. I languished in the emergency room for what seemed like hours. Maybe it had been, before I was taken to radiology and placed inside a monstrous tube that began banging like Animal on drums on Sesame Street as it drew me in. Hold still, intoned the tech's voice over the room speakers when I began to fidget. I wasn't a big fan of confined spaces, so when my shoulder brushed the edges of the machine, I tried to move away. Small spaces didn't used to bother me until I spent almost a year on deployment, riding around in what felt like an armored coffin waiting to be blown up. By the time I was done with the X-ray, I was breathing hard and sweating. My pulse raced like I had just completed an annual physical fitness test. Okay, Sergeant, you can sit up now, instructed the disembodied voice from the speakers. A moment later, the tech entered the room, pushing a wheelchair. Let's get you back to the ER, Sergeant. The trip to and from radiology unfolded into a maze of corridors that I abandoned, trying to remember after the third turn. It seemed like each corner was manned by an attendant giving directions for anyone passing by. The tech deposited me at my bedside and left with the wheelchair once I was back on my bed. A nurse entered a couple minutes later with a small cart covered in wires and stickers. I need you to lie back, Sergeant. When she left, I had stickers attached to my shoulders, chest, and groin, each with wires attached to them and then plugged into the wall monitor. I watched over my shoulder, trying to decipher my cardiac rhythm. But other than deciding that I wasn't about to die, I couldn't remember what the little blips meant. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, counting the holes in the tiles out of boredom. I was awakened by Dr. Zahir knocking at my door as he entered. Your X-ray and EKG appear good, Sergeant Mitchel. Your labs are all over the place, but overall, not bad. Your cholesterol is extremely high, and your white blood cell count is a bit high. You need to follow up with your primary care physician. He laid his clipboard on the table by my bed and pulled a stethoscope out of his pocket. I sat quietly as he listened to my heart before having me sit up. Breathe deeply, he instructed. After several deep breaths, he stepped back. We are sending you home, Sergeant. Your NCO is in the waiting room. Do you have any questions for me? I shook my head no, and he departed. My nurse entered shortly after with discharge papers for me to sign. Okay, Sergeant, she began, setting the papers down for me to sign as she explained them. Doctor, Zahir wants you to follow up with your primary care doctor within 2 days. She slid the paper forward. You have orders for an inhaler in case you need it, along with Motrin for pain. Again, she slid them to me. You can pick them up in the pharmacy on your way out. You also have a mental health appointment Thursday morning at 900 at the clinic. She paused, looking up at me. Any questions? Nope, I said. I just wanted to be out of the hospital. She pulled off all the stickers and set the wires aside, removed my IV, then told me I was free to go before leaving. I slid off the edge of the bed and began getting dressed. My body protested as I bent to don my socks and then my pants. My shirt reeked of acrid smoke, causing me to wrinkle my nose in revulsion. Staff Sergeant Connors waited in the lobby, just as they'd said. His expression conveyed concern, not the disappointment I had expected. You good, Mitchell? Sore, but I'll live, I murmured absently. There's a debrief at 0800 tomorrow, he informed me as we exited the hospital and headed into the parking lot. Once we settled in the car, he continued, there are a lot of questions they're wanting answers to. I don't know much, I began, but Connors halted me. I was instructed to tell you not to discuss it until the debrief tomorrow, he interrupted. All I can tell you is that everyone remains in the dark about what transpired. Chapter 2. Close Encounter. I woke to my cell phone ringing the next morning. Mitchell, I answered. Staff Sergeant Connors' voice greeted me. I'll be by to collect you in 45 minutes, he stated without ceremony. Dress blues. Roger, I responded before he disconnected. I dropped the phone on the bed beside me and groaned. If I thought my body ached before, it was stiff as death this morning. I had barely managed to finish getting dressed when Connors knocked on my front door. Wearing dress blues proved a tedious event, though thankfully I kept a pair pressed and ready in my closet. Arranging the ribbons and miscellaneous decorations was a tedious chore at best. I grabbed my top off the back of the couch as I opened the door. "Morning, boss," I greeted. We pulled up in front of, not the company, but the base commander's building. Inside, the building buzzed with commotion. Nothing was said as I was ushered to the commander's staff briefing room. The room brimmed with more brass than I had ever witnessed in one place, along with other people in suits. Every seat around the oval table was occupied except one, which I knew better than to assume was mine. The door to the room clicked closed behind me as I snapped to attention. "Sergeant Mitchel reporting as ordered, sir." I saluted, not knowing how to act, so I treated it as though I was reporting for a promotion board. I was obviously not getting promoted, but still. The colonel nodded his head in response but did not return the salute. "How are you feeling this morning, Sergeant?" he inquired, almost snapped. "I'll live," I responded. Under the scrutiny of the gathered officials, my composure fractured slightly. It was one thing to address a few senior enlisted or a couple of officers, but another to confront what felt like a firing squad. The faces around the room ranged from neutral to irritation and even intent interest. My company commander appeared as if he had just consumed a lemon. Obviously, he was here out of protocol as my senior officer and no other reason. "Good to hear, Sergeant," responded the base commander, Colonel Sharp. "This is Major General Green," he continued, motioning to the officer to his left. "He is the executive officer to General Stevens." He uttered this like I should know who General Stevens was. He must have registered the confusion on my face. "General Stevens was the general you dragged out of the building with a face wound yesterday." Realization struck me then. "How are the general and others, sir?" I didn't consider if I was supposed to inquire, but it just slipped off my tongue. "General Stevens is recovering, as are others, thanks to you, Sergeant," answered Major General Green. The base commander, Colonel Sharp, motioned me to sit. "You might as well sit, Sergeant. We are going to be here a while." "Yes, sir," I quipped. I occupied the only empty chair and sat upright and stiff at attention. "I want to start by stating that your actions saved the lives of 7 people yesterday," continued Colonel Sharp. "You are being recommended for the Meritorious Service Award for your actions. That being said, the proceedings of this debrief are considered classified. You are not to discuss anything that you see or hear in this room, Sergeant. Is that clear?" It wasn't really a question, but a declaration. I responded anyway. "Crystal, sir." "Can you tell us why you were in that section yesterday, Sergeant?" began Major General Green. I explained our mission and the reason I gave the general when we interrupted whatever was transpiring. Everyone took notes. You could hear paper rustling and pens scribbling with every pause, and the silence unnerved me to the point I welcomed every question just to break the deafening vacuum of sound. I paused to grab a sip of water to carefully compose my answers. I spoke the truth with every word, but I consciously withheld the knowledge of the strange Catwoman from my report. Many of the questions were a repeat of another, but phrased differently. I knew that it was meant to extract any omitted information I might possess. They sought any discrepancies in my answers. After about 5 hours of questions by nearly every person in the room, Colonel Sharp announced the conclusion to the proceedings. "You are dismissed, Sergeant." I sprang to attention, sliding the chair back on the carpet with the back of my legs, saluted and turned to leave. "Remember, Sergeant, not a word." I uttered nothing, just paused a moment before opening the door and departed. Staff Sergeant Connors awaited me outside. He stood as I closed the door behind me. "First Sergeant wants to see you." We stopped at the shop pet briefly for a drink at my insistence, and I stood in front of the first sergeant 30 minutes later with Staff Sergeant Connors standing at parade rest beside me. The base wasn't very big, and thus traversing from one end to the other took no more than 15 minutes by car. "You are being placed on a week of medical leave, Sergeant Mitchell," informed First Sergeant Yosef. "You are to call to check in with Sergeant Connors every day by 1000 hours. You are currently restricted to within 50 miles of the base. Do you understand, Sergeant Mitchell?" "Roger, First Sergeant. Am I being punished, First Sergeant?" I inquired. "No, you're not. There is still an investigation into the event, and you are to be available to report within 2 hours if called," he answered. I wanted to ask about the people injured by the blast, but I feared to inquire since I was ordered not to discuss the event. I left the company an hour later with my leave forms in hand. The moment I stepped outside, I felt as though I was being watched. Maybe it was because of the debrief. I jogged across the road to the research facility parking lot where my truck still sat. Heat assaulted my face as I opened my door. I reached inside, started the engine, and flipped on the AC without climbing in. The heat was too oppressive, and the steering wheel was like touching molten lava. I could still smell the acrid smoke on the breeze, or so I thought. The breeze blew in the wrong direction to pull the smoke across the parking lot. It emanated from the tree line at the edge of the base near the company. I dismissed it as still lingering in my nose from burnt hair or filtered ash stuck in my nose. I closed each nostril and blew in an effort to clear the odor, to no avail, and so gave up. It took about 10 minutes for my truck to cool down enough for me to climb inside without blistering my hands on the interior surfaces. It remained warm, but I only had a few blocks to drive back to my post apartment. The vents had just begun blowing cool, not cold air, when I slipped into the parking lot in front of my apartment. The cool air of my apartment enveloped me as I opened the door. All I craved was to escape my uncomfortable dress blues. They were so heavy it seemed they could insulate you in a blizzard. That was an exaggeration, of course, but I was hot-blooded to begin with. I wanted to just hang them up and forget about them, but I had sweated my ass off in the debriefing. The room had not been hot, but the stress coupled with my uniform had me pouring sweat like a squeezed sponge. I would need to drop them off at the cleaners tomorrow, but right now I needed a shower. A glance at the clock indicated it was almost 6, while my growling stomach signaled it was time to eat. Food would have to wait, as the desire to rid myself of the smell of smoke and scorched paint was paramount. I emerged from my shower reluctantly as I was forced out by the rapidly cooling water. Dinner consisted of another bowl of cereal. I desired something more filling, but I was too exhausted to compel myself out into the world in search of better. I just couldn't bring myself to get dressed for it. I opted for my bed early. I attempted to sleep, but it eluded me like a flitting moth in the nightlight. The room was cool the way I liked it. No light penetrated my sanctum of silence and darkness, but despite my best efforts, I could not get comfortable. Each time I thought I had achieved the comfort I sought, my legs would thrash. This persisted for almost an hour before I sat up on the side of the bed with a huff of frustration. Maybe it's too early, I mused to myself as I slipped out of my room, strode across the living room, and headed out onto the back patio to observe the remnants of the sun's glow recede behind the distance. My thoughts drifted back to the felinoid woman I had saved the day before. No matter where I looked, I could see her crystalline blue eyes staring out of the expanding shadow cast by the bushes, trees, and an errant streetlight. Speaking of the streetlight, I absently noted that it did not activate as the others had. I really didn't mind at the moment, but I guessed I really should report it. Dismissing it, I went back inside to prepare myself a bottle of wine. There were other alternatives, but I really wasn't looking to get drunk, only drink enough to help me sleep. I sipped my Lambrusco as I returned to my patio chair where I sat, scanning my surroundings. The cool breeze offered a welcomed respite from the sweltering heat that heralded the afternoon summer sun. I don't know when I drifted off to sleep, but I woke a little after midnight with a shudder. The cool air normally didn't bother me. However, sitting still reduced my body's ability to regulate temperature. The half glass of wine sat abandoned on the table in front of me, next to my propped-up legs. I leaned back and stared at the clear sky filled with blinking stars just in time to catch the long, golden tail of a falling meteor. The only thing missing from the cool night was the sound of crickets that normally permeated the air. I froze. Something was off. It was then that I felt the warm breath on my ear. I turned my head to find myself face to face with those shimmering blue eyes outlined in a mask of snow-white fur. Her muzzle parted to reveal sharp porcelain teeth as she whispered, "Why?" with what sounded like a growl. I jerked away in response. The sudden motion caused me to spill out of my chair across the concrete patio. Shit! I woke fully a split second before I felt the ground rise to meet me, thumping solidly against my back and then head. I groaned in pain as I sat up in my bed, suddenly scanning the dark room. My head throbbed with a dull headache. I reached up to feel the back of my head in confusion. The dream felt real, even now. I hissed as my hand brushed against the goose egg on the back of my skull. What the hell? I touched it again, just to be sure I was not imagining the injury. Why did you save me? Intoned the soft growl at the foot of my bed. Son of a bitch! I snapped in surprise, flinging myself out of my bed onto the floor, landing on my hands and knees. I scrambled to my feet, headache forgotten, as I squared off against my intruder. Who are you? I demanded. I was not sure if she understood me, but since she had spoken first in English, I automatically assumed she could. She uttered nothing at first, she just sat there as though awaiting my answer. Alexa, lights on, I whispered to the little voice receiver on my nightstand. The lights flashed into existence, causing my uninvited guest to flinch, blink twice, but otherwise fix her eyes on me. Her face was just as I remembered from what I had thought was a dream. I could discern more details now that I could see clearly. She only wore what appeared to be my robe that had been hiding in the back of my closet earlier. The black fabric contrasted against the snow-white short fur that covered most of her body. The fur around her neck and chest was significantly longer, like a reverse mane. I snapped my eyes back up to meet hers. She had not moved. She continued to stare at me with those mesmerizing blue eyes. Her ears lay half flattened to her head. I attempted to relax in an effort to avoid provoking her. Nobody should be experimented on, I stated finally. Who are you? I countered. Her ears perked up slightly, and her head tilted as though contemplating my answer. At least I hoped that was what she was doing. Shacy, she responded. The syllables emerged almost like a soft hiss. I Crathin, she continued, pointing up at the ceiling. Shacy rose to her full height, easily towering over me by a foot. Help? She queried questionably. I could only assume it was a question by the way she tilted her head. She spoke in English, though heavily accented with hisses and growls that required careful attention to fully grasp. How? I asked. I really had no clue what to do. I couldn't exactly report her to my command. I would have to admit my involvement in her escape if I did, and that would definitely not go over well. I rubbed my face in frustration as I sank back down on my bed. Ship, she pointed up. So, you want me to help call your people? My mind began swimming with ideas. Not many were feasible since I didn't have access to such equipment or knew how to build them. She shook her head. Meet ship. Where? I asked. Her ears dipped and she gestured like a plane crashing with her clawed hands. You want me to take you back to where you crashed? Shacy's ears perked up and she nodded. I need my phone, I decided, but when I leaned over to grab it off my nightstand, she rose suddenly. Her ears lay flat. It was not so much her sudden movement that made me stop, but the hiss that escaped her. I need to pull up a map, I explained wearily, before continuing to grab my phone. I held it up and showed her as I unlocked my screen and pulled up Google Maps to show her. Shazy leaned in closer to look. See? I continued, showing her a map of the United States. She could have crashed anywhere, but I guessed it had happened relatively close since they had brought her to my facility rather than another. She reached across the bed and snatched the phone from me. The gesture caused her to scratch my hand, which caused me to snatch it back with a hiss of pain. She instantly snapped her head back up to stare at me with those blue eyes. I froze again. Her tail began to twitch as she studied me. You scratched me, I growled. I had gone from scared half out of my wits to pissed off in that moment. I stood and walked into the master bathroom in search of a Band-Aid, with her following close behind me now. I glanced back at her, stopped, held up my hand and stated, I need a bandage. Shazy reached out with a tentative hand. Paw. Hell, I wasn't even sure of what to call it. She wiped the blood running down my wrist and licked it off thoughtfully. Oh great, I thought. Maybe she's going to decide I'd be better as a snack. I decided to ignore her and began digging under my sink. She would either decide I was food or help. Either way, I needed to stop the bleeding. It took me a moment before I found the gauze and roll of tape to bandage my hand. I literally collided with her when I turned around. I stood perfectly still, unsure what to do. I could discern a lot more details than I had planned for at this range. First and foremost was her height. She was easily a full head taller than I was. Her fur felt silky soft against my bare chest, and I was uncomfortably aware that she was naked despite my robe. I'm guessing she sensed my unease, for she backed away a step before taking my hand and examining it. "I fix," she remarked. She took the supplies from me and began cleaning the wound. She licked the small trickle of blood from my hand before applying the gauze. The feel of her tongue was like sandpaper against my skin. Thankfully, her claws were noticeably absent as she finished up her ministrations. "Better?" she inquired. It still stung a bit, but the bleeding seemed to have stopped. I nodded. "Are you hungry?" I asked suddenly without thought. It was the only thing I could conceive of as a distraction to create distance between us. To my relief, she nodded once and stepped out of the way. "What do you eat?" I inquired absently. There wasn't much in the refrigerator. Milk, beer, jelly, and some lunch meats were all that I had available. "I have ham," I pronounced, holding up the small package. She took it from me and sniffed it. Her nose wrinkled in offense. "It's ham. It is all I have that is not frozen." I reached into the freezer, pulling out 2 steaks I had left in there for the weekend. "I can prepare steak tomorrow," I offered, showing her before tossing them into the fridge. Shazy tore the package open and took a tentative bite. Her ears perked up instantly, and she devoured the contents in a single bite. "Acceptable," she remarked. I pulled a bowl from the cabinet and prepared myself some cornflakes. Before I could object, she took it from me and drank the contents greedily. I eyed her disapprovingly before just grabbing a beer for myself. She leaned forward to sniff it when I twisted the cap free, but she sneezed all over me and my bottle. All I could do was stare at her, then my bottle, and back at her. "Fuck it," I groaned and took a sip. "You can use my bed tonight. You are safe here for the night." I walked into the living room and dropped back onto the couch. Shazy hesitated but nodded and vanished into my bedroom. Chapter 3. On the Run. I stirred to Shazy curled up on the couch next to me. Her furred legs were warm against mine, her tail draped loosely around my calf. Her head rested at the other end as she snored softly. Or so I thought until I placed a hand on her side. I don't know what possessed me to touch her like some large cat. For a brief moment I sensed what I believed was a snore reverberating through her body, but the moment I contacted her, she bolted awake with a hiss. She hunched low and close, her ears flattened to her head in agitation. I remained perfectly still as she leaned close to my face and sniffed me. I held her gaze for what felt like an eternity. I started to reach up to touch her face, but she snarled and pulled away. "I found ship," she announced, holding up my phone. "Not far." The moment shattered. I closed my eyes with a sigh. In the darkness behind my eyelids, her eyes gleamed like a beacon. I could still feel her warmth against my bare legs. Her scent evoked fresh-cut cedar. I opened my eyes to find her scrutinizing me questionably. "Show me," I demanded. She handed me the phone. She was right. It was definitely not far away. According to the coordinates she had pulled up, her ship rested somewhere in the North Carolina mountains. "It will take us all day to drive there," I remarked. "Luckily, my father lives not far from there. We can stay there while we make plans." I noticed then that she wore what appeared to be pieces of cloth covering her hips, loins, and chest that looked suspiciously familiar. "I need to dress and pack," I stated. I instantly recognized why the fabric looked familiar. The thick cotton sheets lay shredded and strewn all over my bed. I dressed quickly in cargo pants and a t-shirt that read Army across the front. I packed an assortment of clothes and gear in 2 duffels. I grabbed my 9mm and stowed my AR-15 into one of my bags. I hoped I would not need them, but considering my circumstances, it was definitely a possibility. I slipped out of the front door, tossed my bags into the back of my truck, and scanned around cautiously for any sign of witnesses. Confident nobody watched, I opened the passenger door and motioned for her to get in. Her presence highlighted how obvious her differences were, and I rushed back inside to grab an old hoodie I had hanging in my closet. I ran back out, closing the door behind me, and flung it at her as I jumped into the driver's seat. "Put that on," I commanded. "Cameras are everywhere on the base." The realization hit me too late, but there was nothing to do about it now. All I could do was put as much distance between the base and us as I could before someone noticed her on camera. We had just made it onto the highway when my phone rang. Sergeant Connors appeared on the caller ID. "Shit," I spat as I accepted the call. "Morning, boss." "Just checking in on you. You missed call-in this morning," came Connors' voice sternly over the phone. "Sorry about that, Sergeant. I'm on my way to Gettysburg this morning." It was the only plausible excuse that I hoped placed me far enough away that he would not ask me to come in and still be close enough that I would not get into trouble. "General Green was asking about you this morning." There was a pause. "He wants to meet with you again today. How soon can you get back to the base?" asked Connors. My mind raced to devise some excuse to delay my return for as long as possible. "It will take me about an hour to get back to my truck," I lied. "Then there's the drive back," I continued. "Any idea what's up?" "No idea," came the reply. "I'm guessing they have some more questions?" "I don't know, though. Start heading back. I'll let Top know." The phone disconnected without warning. "Son of a bitch," I growled. "I hope you are worth it," I snapped at Shazy. She glared at me with a dangerous look. "Don't worry, I'm not going to turn you in, but either it's a coincidence or the general suspects something." Shazy said nothing, only continued to stare at me. It was hard to make out her expression with her head covered. Her ears were so much a part of her expression, it was difficult to guess her mood without seeing them react. I gave up and turned my attention back to the road ahead of me. We rode in silence for about an hour before she laid a clawed hand on my thigh and squeezed. "I protect you, soft human." I snapped a glance at her, blinked twice, opened my mouth, closed it. The gesture was unexpected. What did she mean by protecting me? Why was she touching me? My mind swirled with a mixture of questions and emotions. "Thanks," I mumbled, unsure how to respond. She was beautiful in the way you would judge a predator, but not in the way you would describe a person. The memory of her soft fur against mine this morning drifted back. The smell of fresh-cut pine was definitely stronger in the close confines of the cab. Her hand resting gently on my leg was not helping the temperature I felt building in my face. I needed a distraction. "Why are you here?" I inquired. She didn't hesitate in her response as though expecting it. "We watched a long time." Her hand withdrew. "We crashed after engine fail. My team all died." I glanced back over to see her looking out the side passenger window. I didn't have to see her face to hear the loss in her voice. "I will do everything I can to get you back to your people." She looked back over at me and nodded once before turning back to the window. I couldn't help but feel sorry for her, even though I suspected she didn't want my sympathy. All I could do was try to keep my promise to get her back to her ship if it was still there. If it wasn't. My thoughts were interrupted when I spotted a state trooper tapping his brakes as he passed by on the other side of the highway. It vanished over the hill, but it was enough to make me nervous. I hit the first exit and turned off onto one of the side roads and stopped to wait. Shazy turned back to me in alarm. "Police," I said. The trooper came flying by on the highway with his lights on, as I feared. "We are going to have to switch to the back roads," I remarked as I pulled back onto the two-lane road. My unease didn't subside until about an hour later. The roads wound through small towns and rural farmland, with hardly another car in sight. I checked our gas once I saw a gas station come into view. "We need fuel," I announced. "Just lay down in the back seat. I'll get gas and food." Shazy had just climbed over the center console into the back when I pulled into the pump. I glanced around uneasily as I climbed out. I took a deep breath, calming my nerves before closing the door and grabbing the nozzle. Filling the truck from barely above a quarter tank seemed to take an eternity. "This has to be the slowest pump in the state," I thought impatiently. I made up my mind and left it to continue while I headed inside to get drinks and something to eat. I emerged several minutes later with a cheap pizza, half a dozen waters, and a Pepsi. The pump had finally stopped by the time I reached the truck. No sooner had I replaced the nozzle than I heard the distant wail of a siren. Ah, shit. I scrambled into the driver's seat, shifted to drive, and tore out of the parking lot with a spraying of gravel everywhere, in what I hoped was the opposite direction. No such luck. The cop car blew by in the direction we had come. Brake lights told me all I needed to know. I pulled over and yelled for Shacy to get out before he could get turned around. She didn't question and vanished into the trees seconds before the cop car came skidding to a stop behind me. "Put your hands out of the window," shouted the officer. I glanced back at my mirror and saw him standing behind his open car door with his pistol drawn. I did as I was told and waited. Nothing. I looked back through the mirror and saw nothing. Just then the truck door opened. I nearly jumped out of my skin as Shazy climbed back in. "Go," she stated flatly. I didn't question. I slammed on the gas and found the first road I came to. My GPS began to complain insistently until I turned it off in frustration. "What happened to the officer?" I asked after several long minutes. "Dead." She said nothing more about it. We just continued to drive in a southwesterly direction. The only thing I could think of was to ignore the GPS directions in an effort to avoid being spotted. I didn't think they knew where I was going, but they definitely knew the general direction. It would not take them long to find out where my dad lived and deduce my destination. Half an hour later, my phone rang. Staff Sergeant Connors was calling. I ignored it. It did give me an idea, however. I slowed down enough to control the steering with my knee while I pried my phone apart and pulled the SIM card out. I didn't toss it. I was not even sure if it would work, but I needed the map still pulled up on my phone. Shacy watched me with curiosity evident on her face. "They track us," I explained. I found a hidden dirt road that led off into a field guarded by an old cattle gate and turned in. I motioned for her to wait while I slipped out and rushed over to open the gate. Thankfully, it was not locked, only secured by a wrapped chain. I unsecured the gate, ran back to the truck, and crept in slowly before exiting again to brush the grass upright as best as possible and close the gate. Back inside, I turned to slowly drive along the fence line to hide my tracks. I didn't want to leave tire marks leading up into the field. The moment we neared a tree line, I turned up the hill with my truck in four-wheel drive. We stopped just over the hill, and I turned it off. "We need to wait," I commented. I managed to slip the truck under the dense canopy of the trees. It turned out to be the wisest decision I had made when a helicopter flew over an hour later. The best we could hope for was that there was no heat-sensing equipment on the helicopter, or my best efforts would be wasted. The helicopter continued to circle overhead for hours in increasingly larger circles. We waited and watched in silence for nearly 5 hours. Sirens were heard in the distance, and even a few police cars and an SUV drove past. When it didn't seem like we would be discovered, I began watching Shaza more closely. We sat on the tailgate together. I tried to be subtle at first in my observation, or so I thought I was being subtle. I had not realized that I was openly staring at her until I caught her looking back at me with her ears perked up. "Why you stare?" she asked pointedly. I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again and sighed. "I am sorry. I have never met an alien before," I stammered like a fool. One ear twitched and her lips curled briefly. "I have met many?" I blinked in confusion. "Really?" I mentally cursed myself. "You're definitely an idiot," I thought to myself. "But you are able to fly across space to our planet." It was partially a question and a statement of fact. "Yep, definitely an idiot." "Space is empty," she responded. "Your species all we found in this part of space." Shazy's ear swiveled around like a radar searching before snapping around to the field. I followed her gaze in alarm before spotting a lone doe cautiously gliding through the tall grass. "Deer," I explained. "Many people hunt them." Her attention turned back to me. "Do you hunt?" she quizzed. I shook my head. "I know how, but choose not to." Shazy tilted her head slightly in a manner that I quickly learned was a questioning expression. "You not warrior?" The question stung slightly and my face warmed. "I am a nurse medic. I save lives." I quickly added, "But I know how to fight." Shazy studied me for several long moments. Her expression was unreadable. "I am pilot," she said finally. "How did you get captured?" The words came tumbling out of my mouth before my brain could intercept the thought. Shazy's ears flattened to her head. Her tail froze. She was deathly quiet. I waited in horror for her to rip me apart. Her muzzle wrinkled, showing a row of ivory white teeth. They were definitely sharp enough to rend flesh from bone. The only sound came from her claws raking against metal. Then all the air seemed to leave her body with a frustrated sigh. It was in that second I realized we had both been holding our breath. I landed on edge of mountain and it fell. It was a statement of fact. There were three. I all that lived. I am sorry, I whispered. Shazy slipped off the tailgate. I need get back. She headed back the way we had come. I watched her stride away with renewed, albeit agitated determination. Her tail twitched behind her until she was out of sight over the hill. I scurried around the truck and into the driver's seat. I kept the headlights off all the way down the hill to avoid detection. Only the amber markers illuminated my path. Shazy waited for me at the bottom with the gate pulled open. I stopped just long enough for her to slip into the seat beside me. The rest of the trip was made in silence. I didn't know how we managed to make it all the way into the mountains without being spotted. I thought about driving to my father's as was originally planned, but decided against it. The military would undoubtedly be watching the house. I opted instead for a remote back road near the parkway until I found what appeared to be a dilapidated barn. We need to rest, I said, cutting the truck off. You sleep. I'll keep watch for a few hours. I jumped out and retrieved my duffel bags from the back. Shazy watched me pull out my military uniform. I considered ducking out of sight to change, but suspected she would just follow me. I decided there was very little reason to trust me entirely. I looked up and locked eyes with her as I pulled on my pants. Sleep, I commanded, a little embarrassed. She might be an alien, but she was female. Normally it would not bother me, but the way she watched me like a predator sizing up its prey was a little unnerving. Shazy's ear twitched in what I had learned was amusement before leaping over the edge of the bed with ease. She stretched with the most feline grace I had ever seen. It started with her arching her back and then her shoulders before settling down to watch me lazily. I was keenly aware of her tail swaying lazily across the bottom of the bed. Your skin is white like my fur, she remarked. Damn it. I could feel my face warm in embarrassment. Fascinating, she commented. Why your skin turns red? I quickly pulled my shirt on. Go to sleep, I hissed. Her lips curled back slightly, and both her ears twitched in amusement. She didn't say anything more, but she continued to watch me through laden eyes. I felt the vibration before I heard what sounded like a low, rumbling purr. I finished lacing my last boot before turning to watch her unhindered. Her fur was the color of fresh snow. Her mane outlined her strong facial features. I watched her ear flick as the breeze ruffled the long tufts at the ends and smiled. She was beautiful, I thought, and then shook my head and returned to my duffel containing my AR-15. I checked the 430-round magazines I had brought with me, slid one into my rifle, and pulled the charging handle back. I allowed it to close softly so I would not wake Shazy and stepped away, tapping the forward assist to seat the first round. I managed to find a ladder to the upper loft and discovered a way to watch the surrounding field. There was a multitude of small, rotted openings in which to observe our surroundings. I flipped the on switch to my solar-charged laser scope and cursed. Months of leaving it sitting in my closet had allowed it to lose its charge. I did the only thing I could think of. I sat as still and quiet as possible to listen to the sounds of crickets. I didn't fool myself with thoughts of superiority, but I knew most soldiers and civilian officers were no better than I was and count on any who happened by us to make mistakes I could catch. I thought I would begin to tire until I noticed the first hint of sunrise began to make itself known. The night had begun in frustration. Despite my best efforts to listen to the night sounds, all I could hear was my heart pounding in my ears. I was not sure when it had subsided, but I slowly began to admit to myself that I was scared senseless. How we had managed to get this far without being discovered had to be out of sheer luck. I was wrapped up in my thoughts when Shazy slipped up behind me and lightly touched my shoulder. If I had been a cat, I would have lost half my lives in that single moment. I jumped, spun, and ended up on my backside, staring up at Shazy's ice blue eyes. I don't know how I managed not to let out the most unmanly screech, but I felt it stuck in my throat. I cleared it and scrambled back to a crouching position. Don't do that, I growled under my breath. You sleep, she stated simply. I nodded once and positioned myself against a wall to sit with my rifle in my lap. We had depended on each other thus far. I doubted that was about to change. The sun was high in the sky when I opened my eyes. The air was hot but cooler than it was back in Maryland by a noticeable margin. I glanced at the watch I had brought with me. 2 o'clock. "Anything?" I asked, stretching with a yawn. "Native prey," she responded, without looking back at me. "I'm hungry. Want anything?" I asked. A flick of her left ear was all I got in response. I scrambled down the ladder to where my gear waited in the truck. I retrieved a couple of MREs, penny with tomato sauce and chicken. I shuddered at the thought of either choice. Neither was good in my opinion. I stepped out of the barn and tossed the chicken up to Shazy. She snatched it out of the air effortlessly and glanced at it, and then me. I opened mine and began rummaging around the contents. Shazy followed my example. The MRE fell to my feet, and I looked up. Shazy stared down at me, hissed in disdain. "I didn't say it was good," and I countered. "Better than nothing?" "Unlikely," responded Shazy. We were moving an hour later through the thick underbrush of the forest. According to the map on my phone, we were 4 or 5 hours hike away from her ship, unless the military had already moved it. Shazy moved like a ghost through the thicket while I sounded like a thundering bull in a china shop to my ears. The trees thinned and the underbrush became sparse the farther we walked. The travel was slow but deliberate. We stopped occasionally to listen for anything out of place. It was nearing dusk when we encountered the first sign something was out of place. Shazy growled as she studied the dirt like a shaman, reading the bones of his enemies. "What?" I asked. "Tracks," she whispered. "Fresh." I glanced around urgently but saw nobody. "Which way did they go?" Shazy pointed south. "Tracks are heavy," she remarked. "4 sets." The tracks could have belonged to a group or family of hikers, but I was not confident in my assessment. I studied the tracks she pointed out. My hopes were dashed when I saw the print. They were similar to mine. Desert tan military boots. "We need to go before they return." Shazy nodded and pointed west. "Not far," she remarked. "We go separate." I began to argue, but she held up a clawed hand. "They find us together. They know. I will follow out of sight." I didn't like the idea, but Shazy had a point. They were looking for a nearly 7-foot-tall Catwoman and a soldier together. I could easily be mistaken for any other soldier unless they got close enough to read my name tape. "Be careful," I said before marching ahead. I encountered 2 more patrols on my way. I managed to slip by the first one by asking if they had found anything while I continued without stopping, only slowing to hear their response. The second patrol consisted of 2 older soldiers with significantly more experience than either I or the first group had. "Stop!" I froze instinctively. "Identify," the sergeant ordered. "Sergeant Metcalf," I lied. The ruse would not last much longer. My mind raced as they approached. "Major General Green wants to see me," I said, buying time. The one talking was almost upon me while his partner lagged behind with his rifle partially shouldered. Before I could react and give her away, Shazy slipped from behind a tree 2 feet from the other, grabbed his head and spun it around. He dropped like a stone with a crashing of dead leaves. The other soldier spun around but didn't make a sound. The only noise came from the butt of my rifle hitting the side of his neck. He dropped instantly, unconscious but alive. I slung my rifle and grabbed the fallen soldiers. I stripped him of his ammo, armor, and radio. I only took the dead soldier's ammo and a pair of night vision goggles. Shazy didn't wait around. She simply blended back into the forest like an apparition. There was no way I would be able to return to my former life now. I could play off the trooper's death by blaming Shazy, but not this. I whispered an apology to the deceased soldier and continued on. Quicker now. It would not take long before the one regained consciousness or someone found them. The stolen radio screamed to life. Everyone knew we were coming now. We were thankfully close by this point. Dusk was quickly giving way to darkness. It was a mixed blessing at this point. While I was forced to switch to night vision, I could also see the area around the spacecraft lit up in a greenish-white light that was nearly too much for the goggles I had. Thankfully, they were the single monocle instead of the Cyclops version I was used to from deployment. Shazy joined me at the edge of the clearing. There was no sound announcing her arrival. Just the subtle brush of her tail against my leg was all the notice I got. "Now what?" I whispered. The ship was so black that it seemed to steal away the light wherever it touched it. There were no obvious signs of angular construction. Everything appeared smooth and unbroken from our vantage point. "We go there," she said, pointing at a lower section of the craft. There is a docking port, but how are we going to get to it? As if to emphasize my point, a couple of soldiers started to pass by, but came to an abrupt halt when the dog one controlled began to pull out his leash and bark urgently. I cursed under my breath. "I'll distract them," I said louder for Shazy to hear me. Before she could argue, I brought my rifle up and fired. I had two goals at this point: kill the dog, which I had, and force the soldiers to take cover. My plan worked perfectly until the bark of the tree next to me exploded. I dove aside for cover without thinking about it. I tried to press myself into the ground and fire back at the same time. I managed to get off half a dozen rounds before the dirt around me erupted into mini explosions, and I was forced to slide farther back into cover. The instant I lost sight of the two soldiers, I scrambled on hands and knees to a tree a dozen feet away. I would fire a couple 3-round bursts and move. This worked well enough until I felt hot fire lance through my hip. The force of impact sent me sprawling through the thin brush. I was intentionally trying not to hit anyone, but the searing pain of a flanking shot made it painfully clear that they had no reservations. I dragged myself by my elbows across the ground as fast as I could. By unexpected luck, I managed to retain my rifle. I fired blindly behind me every few feet until I was out of ammo. I subconsciously felt the ground begin to vibrate, and the air began to buzz like a swarm of bees. The bullets stopped raining down in my direction. I took the opportunity to reload and began to drag myself toward the sound of gunfire. I wanted to make sure she got away before someone decided to see if I was still alive, and I was captured. What started out as a buzz quickly turned into a deafening shrill that made my ears feel like they were going to bleed if I didn't cover them, which I did. The shrill didn't subside as I had hoped. Instead, it continued with intermittent explosions that shook the ground violently. I lay on the ground covering my ears, my eyes closed in pain. I felt as though my head were about to explode if it continued. I barely noticed someone lifting me up. Even the pain in my head drowned out all other feelings of punishment. I forced my eyes open long enough to see a white shape blocking my vision before I completely blacked out. Chapter 4. Augmentation. Ah! I peeled open my eyes slowly to a brightly lit room. Am I dead? I groaned as I pushed myself up, disoriented. The disorientation didn't linger, though. The instant I sat up, I felt the searing pain in my hip reassert itself. "Motherfucker," I yelled and fell back, writhing in pain. I'm not sure how long the pain persisted, but it eased noticeably when I remained very still. "Hello," I shouted to anyone who could hear me. It was evident nobody would come for me after a dozen attempts to summon someone, anyone. I yearned to examine my wound, but any chance was thwarted by shooting pain anytime I attempted to steal a glance. Someone would have to check on me at some point, I mused. I resorted to studying my sterile environment while I waited. I had expected to perish in the field, or, at the least, be captured. Who had captured me? I wondered. The room comprised a myriad of what I suspected was medical equipment, though I couldn't identify most of it. The walls were plastered with monitors displaying symbols that were a mystery to me. The only thing I could discern was the electronic image of what I could only describe as a crime scene figure. I winced in pain when the room jolted without warning. The sensation sent a wave of nausea surging into my throat, and I thought I would vomit. A second violent jolt pitched me spilling out of the bed onto the floor. I caught a brief glimpse of the floor rushing up to meet my face before the world faded to black again. I was back in my bed when my eyes suddenly snapped open, regrettably. The bright light pierced my eyes and drilled directly into my skull like an ice pick boring into my brain. "Damn it," I growled. "Someone shut off the stupid lights." "You are awake," purred the sibilant voice from across the room. I worried. "Shacy?" I could make out her general direction, but the intense light prevented me from opening my eyes fully. "I am here," she responded. The words sounded slightly different this time. They lacked the thick accent I was accustomed to, and the words seemed off, like they were just slightly delayed. "Do you understand me?" she asked. "Yeah," I answered, half as a question and half as a statement. "It will improve as the microscopic robots adjust to your neurological patterns." Shazy came into view. Her normally loose mane was tied back this time and cascaded over her right shoulder, clean and shining. I was concerned they might not function, but your injuries were severe. I dared not utilize any of our drugs. I squinted against the light until I could barely discern her face. You resemble an angel, I blurted out to my horror. I clamped my eyes shut in embarrassment. I'm sorry, I moaned. Shacey's right ear twitched in amusement. You rest. I will dim the lights. She laid a clawed hand on my shoulder gently. We are safe now. I will check on you later. Shacey moved away and the lights dimmed a moment later. I opened my eyes finally to a room bathed in a dim blue haze. The screens I had observed earlier were blurred, but glowed with the intensity of a full moon. I was surprised to discover the pain from earlier had reduced to a dull throbbing when I shifted my weight cautiously. Oh, thank God, I breathed in relief. I drifted in and out of sleep several times during the night. Sometimes the room was quiet. Other times I caught glimpses of Shacey hovering over me. The glimpses into the waking world were fleeting each time. Each felt like a dream I couldn't retain, but I knew were real. I didn't know how much time had elapsed when I finally awoke completely. My eyes fluttered open to be greeted by a darkened room. I blinked a couple times to clear the haze glossed over my eyes to find myself in a room similar to the last. The screen still glowed with a bluish light, except that I could read the data scrolling past. Heart rate, blood pressure, even cardiac and respiratory data. I slipped out from beneath the sheets and began exploring my surroundings. I approached the table closest to my bed and studied the controls. I curiously tapped the button labeled power, and a holographic display sprang to life. The image that greeted me was of myself. I examined the data flickering on the display. Audio augmentation, complete. Retinal enhancement, complete. Wound regeneration, 98%. What the hell? I whispered to the empty room. I tapped the audio augmentation button, and another smaller screen materialized on the holographic display. Translation algorithm active. Audio amplification, 20%. I tapped the retinal enhancement button, and the small screen transformed. Translation matrix activated. Light receptor amplification, 15%. Range focusing, 10%. I gazed at the projection in disbelief. I began scanning the room a couple of minutes later, for I didn't know what. Shacey! I shouted. I spun around when the door hissed open like a steam-powered piston. She leaned against the frame in the doorway, staring at me quietly. What did you do to me? I demanded accusingly. Nothing. Only the slightest flicker of her ears, and her lazily swaying tail betrayed her amusement. What? I challenged indignantly. I am just wondering if you desire to dress for a meal, she smirked. I didn't grant her the dignity of a response. I simply turned so she couldn't see my face flushed scarlet while I scanned the room for clothes. I could feel her eyes burning into my back as I sorted through the small pile of clothes nearby. They were white and the texture of silk. The soft fabric felt cool against the skin and flowed easily with each movement. Thank God they aren't sheer, I thought. I didn't think I could endure much more embarrassment. There were no shoes, which I guess made sense since Shacey apparently needed none. Shacey guided me through a myriad of gray corridors to a large room filled with tables and benches. There were no chairs with backs for the Krathen to occupy awkwardly with their tails. The room could easily accommodate a dozen Krathen with plenty of room to maneuver. I claimed the first table I encountered while Shacey retrieved a couple bowls of what resembled broth. The smell that greeted me reminded me of a spicy beef stew. My stomach chose that very moment to emit the loudest growl I had ever experienced. Shacey lifted her bowl and took a sip and watched me over the brim, obviously expecting me to emulate her. I took a tentative sip and then a bigger one. She set her bowl down and awaited my questions. There was so much I yearned to say. I wanted to rail at her for the augmentations. I wanted to demand that she remove them. What I uttered was, "Thank you." She apparently anticipated my questions. Micro-robots healed your wound. Almost died. Shacey took another sip of her broth to allow the revelation to sink in. Translation algorithm was planned. Others were not. I believe robots modified senses because they interpreted them as injury. She splayed her hands open. I am no healer. I decided to shift the subject. There was nothing that could be done about the changes at the moment. I wasn't even sure I wished to reverse them if we could. Where are we? How long have I been unconscious? I will show you on the bridge. She paused. You were unconscious for 8 solar cycles. I must have appeared worried. We are safe, but the ship is damaged. I'm guessing we are still on the planet? Shazy nodded. Were you able to summon help? She shook her head. What do we do now? I asked finally. They will come when I do not report, she stated. How long? I inquired. She seemed to contemplate my question. 18 solar cycles, she stated finally. She gestured with one hand, orbiting a fist. Days, I translated. She nodded. Shazy gathered up our dishes when we were done and placed them into a drawer. Clean, she explained before beckoning for me to follow. The trip to the bridge was down the hall and 2 floors up. We took a lift that released us out into a short, wide gray hall. A bulkhead slid open as we approached. I could discern a canopy of trees through the center window before we even entered the wide yet shallow room. The bridge held 4 seats. They were designed to be occupied from the center of the room since the backs were supported only on one side. The seat to the left bore a hole punctured through it and what resembled old blood staining the fabric protruding through the back. Shazy tapped a series of buttons on the right foremost console, and a heads-up display flickered to life. She seemed to pointedly avert her gaze from the damaged seat. I scanned the room in awe. Damage was evident within the room. Panels displayed scorch marks from either fires or electrical burns. The forward window exhibited several cracks, spidering out from a central source where an obvious hole admitted the sound of rustling leaves and running water. I felt that I could actually smell the water if I closed my eyes, but I would test that ability later. I focused on the map flickering on the screen. Shazy pointed at a purple dot on the map. We are here. I studied the map closely. This is Boone, I stated, indicating the map just west of us. Can you zoom in, please? Shazy tapped a couple keys on the console, and it narrowed to reveal what appeared to be streets. I followed them, and my eyes widened. We are still close to where we were. It was a statement of fact, not an accusation. I honestly expected us to be halfway across the world. We settled into a routine over the following week. We consumed ship rations in the morning, and Shazy hunted in the afternoon, while I delved into the Krathen database to comprehend her people better. The rest of the day was devoted to working on ship systems, pointedly the communication system. We were both out of our depth when it came to understanding the complicated circuitry and schematics. It didn't deter us from arguing over the manual's explanation anyway. We paused occasionally to explore my new heightened senses. It turned out that I could actually perceive water at close distances. It smelled like a mix of stone and rain. Sounds were crisper, and I could concentrate on things 3 times as far as before. It was one of those days that our dynamics shifted. Shacy and I had opted to go hunting instead of crawling through the bowels of the ship. She crouched close to my side, coaching me through a series of exercises meant to expand my senses in an effort to maximize my potential. I listened intently to the rustling of leaves, the slightest cracking of branches, and the scent of her. I knew I should have been focusing on the deer we had been stalking for the past hour, but the feel of her soft tail against my leg and her breath on my ear became a distraction I could not shake. My attention was captivated by the scent of sweet pine, mixed with mineral-enriched water from the ship's recycling system, which tugged at my senses. The rustling of leaves was replaced by the low rumble of her voice caressing my ear with her warm breath. I couldn't help myself. I pressed my face in against hers and rubbed against her. Shazy froze, unable to react. Her insistent purr ceased abruptly, and she jerked away to stare at me. My face flushed so hard that I thought it would melt from the heat. I'm sorry, I whispered. Shazy blinked twice, turned and returned to the ship without a word. I watched her depart in silence, all the while berating myself in my mind. The moment shattered, and I worried that I had overstepped my bounds. I found Shazy waist-deep under one of the bridge consoles, only her tail twitching in agitation, and hind paws betrayed her presence. Her tail stilled as I approached. I wanted to speak but restrained myself and headed for the dining facility. Shazy was noticeably absent the next morning for breakfast. What had become our routine was disrupted. I found her studying astronomical maps on the bridge. She kept her back pointedly turned. "I'm going to meet an old friend for some supplies." Her tail flicked in acknowledgement, but she otherwise ignored me. I trekked through the woods at a brisk but cautious pace, dressed in my damaged fatigues. I could still smell the burn of powder and the metallic scent of blood despite them being cleaned. Somehow the smell resurrected the phantom sting of where the bullet had pierced my hip. I waited until I was several miles from the ship before I drew my cell phone from my pocket, inserted the SIM card, and dialed. The phone rang 3 times before he finally answered. "Hello?" "Mark, it's Seth." There was a short pause. "What the hell, brother? You are plastered all over the news." "I imagine. Look, I require a favor," I continued. I outlined the supplies I needed and arranged the meeting point before powering off the phone and extracting the SIM card. It was a risk, but I had nobody else I could call. Mark was the closest friend I had outside the military. We had actually forged a close friendship long before I entered the military. If anyone could assist, it would be Mark. I just needed to cover another 10 miles by noon through dense vegetation and unseen. I found Mark seated in his Jeep a little before 1, awaiting me. "Hey, brother," I called from cover. Mark jumped as though bitten. I had been circling his location for nearly half an hour to ensure nothing was amiss. I didn't think he would betray me, but I had to verify he hadn't been followed. "Good to see you." Mark took my outstretched hand and pulled me in for a brief hug. "What happened?" he asked. I explained as much as I could, without divulging too much detail. I didn't want to entangle him in my mess more than I had already. "Are you certain about this?" he asked. "No," I answered honestly, "but I am already in this deep." Mark nodded and gestured to the 2 large duffels in the back. "I got everything you asked for. I even pitched in some more ammo for your AR." "Thank you. You have no idea how much this means." I hoisted the 2 duffels. One I slung on my back and the other across my neck on top of the other. "Tell my dad you saw me and what's happening," I stated before turning to begin the more than 10 miles back to the ship. I returned a few hours after dark to find Shazy perched on the loading ramp of her ship. "I worried," was all she said as I approached. "I required supplies," I remarked. I was tired and dirty from my hard march back. I had taken the most indirect route I could devise for my return just in case. She didn't utter anything more, nor did she attempt to stop me as I climbed back into the ship. I tossed my bags onto my bunk without bothering to inspect them. I instead opted for the shower. I emerged half an hour later, clad in the soft robes provided by the cabin's previous occupant. Mark had been true to his word. I now possessed half a dozen military uniforms, a med bag, a burner phone, and a few hundred rounds of 5.56 for my AR, and a Glock 43X. What wasn't included on the list was a folded piece of paper. "Be careful, brother," it read. "I don't know what you have gotten yourself into, but I have programmed in the number to my own burner phone just in case. Don't hesitate to call." I folded the letter and slipped it back into one of the bags. I didn't bother to head back out, instead choosing to recline on my bunk to sleep. Shazy continued to avoid me over the next few days. I did catch glimpses of her observing me as I traced burnt wires. Each time I turned to meet her gaze, however, all I saw was her retreating figure. The silence began to wear on me, but I didn't know how to resolve it. I yearned to hear her voice, but I feared I would only exacerbate the problem. It did culminate on my 4th day back. I happened to round a corner without looking where I was going, and literally collided with Shazy. I instinctively reached up to prevent knocking her over. There was no chance that I actually would, but the reaction was instinctive. She froze in my grip, but I couldn't bring myself to release her. I couldn't help but marvel at her scent and the feel of her coat in my hands. Before I could stop myself, I asked, "Do you wish for me to leave?" We locked eyes for an endless number of heartbeats. I found myself drawn into the icy blue depths of her eyes as they explored my deep brown. "No," she finally responded. Shacy extended a tentative clawed hand to brush my cheek. "You offer too much," she breathed. "I offer it freely," I responded. Shacy cradled my face in her hand a moment longer and then nodded. Radio almost repaired, she stated, changing the subject. It had the desired effect. The moment vanished. We ate in silence again that evening. We had managed to repair the radio, as predicted. The transmission was brief, only a set of coordinates. We dared not replay the message just in case the military was listening. There was not even any way of knowing if it would be received.